Okay, hello everyone, welcome and thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I will be your co-host. This is The War for Ukraine, a historical and contemporary analysis, part two. We had part one back on March 5th. Let's go ahead and get started. This program is being recorded for YouTube, and so you can watch it later, or if you have to jump off early, it'll be available. We'll email out the links for it, but that might not be until tomorrow. So we'll email the links if you need to jump off. And this program is being presented by our good friends at History, Mostly Ancient Discussions meetup group based in New York City, and then also the Washington, D.C. History and Culture Organization, our sister groups, Baltimore History and Culture, New York History and Culture, and London History and Culture. My name is Robert Kellerman. I'm currently joining you from Texas. I split my time between Texas and Washington, D.C., and I'm a big history buff. And with that, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have actually a few more hosts than just this distinguished group, but we'll go through from left to right. Richard, you want to introduce yourself very quickly?
Hi, my name is Richard Sassoon. I'm a lawyer by training, so this is just my fun activity and hobby. I'll walk you through a little bit of the history of Ukraine, and then I'll sort of give it over to the rest of the panelists to sort of discuss more pressing issues, more pressing questions. Please put those either in the chat or in the Q&A so we can organize them. And we're really excited to hear and to meet you and to talk to you about this situation.
Awesome. And Richard recently hosted our 5-part History of the Crusades series. So I'll also email that and post the links for that in the chat in Zoom. Aaron, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. I'm Aaron De Los Reyes, and I live in northern New Jersey. I work in technology engineering, and I spent over a dozen years in the U.S. Army and armored cavalry. And I'm a big history buff. I work with Richard and Zach on a bunch of history of the last 300 to 500 years programs.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, welcome, Aaron. And our good friend Zakar is the brains of this operation. So Zakar, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, guys. You guys see my video?
Oh, yes. Yep.
Hi, guys. My name is Zakar. So I'm a finance professional, actually. But I've started this group called History Most Ancient, and you can check out the link and we'll post it later. But today, basically, we tried to create a panel. I just want to make it very short, sweet, and panel that will discuss the Ukrainian conflict, and we'll walk through it. But I just want to say a couple of things about my group. History Most Ancient. We particularly focused on ancient medieval history, but now recently we've started doing the more modern and collaborate with Robert. And the beginning video that we just played, that was sent to me by a friend of mine who is right now in Kiev. He was my classmate in high school in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. And that was the video of Mariupol, which is in eastern Ukraine, and it completely destroyed. So without further ado, I'll let Robert speak, or whoever else you want to introduce. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Zakar. So we have a couple other guests joining us. We don't have his photo, but our distinguished panelist also includes Greg. Greg, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi. So my name is Greg Rizak. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Yep. I was born and grew up in Moscow, and moved in to United States during the communist time, like 42 years ago.
Yep.
Both of my parents were born in Ukraine and came to live in Moscow as teenagers during the World War II. So I have kind of relatives and friends on both sides. But clearly, I support Ukraine in this. All right.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Appreciate that. And we have one more panelist. Daniel, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, all, and other times. My name is Daniil Andreevich Havetskov. I was born in Kiev, Ukraine, and I spent my first 19 years of life growing up there. When I was 20, I moved to these United States. So professionally, I work for an international humanitarian organization, Doctors Without Borders, in their HQ in New York. I help them raise money. By night, I'm Batman, and I have a finance background. I'm a Baruch College alumni. I think Zahar is Bearcat as well. My favorite colors are purple and white. I'm a cat person, and my favorite food is pizza. And just to settle this debate once and for all, pineapples do not go on pizza. Never. And little fun fact, I've been to every single castle in Ukraine, and in Ukraine there are just like a few dozens of them. So I'm a huge history buff, and I came to this group by accident, and I'm very happy to be here.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you. Welcome. And again, if you were joining us late, this is The War for Ukraine, a historical and contemporary analysis. So we're going to go talk to the situation from both a historical and contemporary standpoint. This program is being recorded, so if you have to jump off early, if you want to watch it again, or if you know anyone else that'd be interested, it'll be available on YouTube. We'll email out the link for that, but that probably won't take place until tomorrow. And if you have any questions or comments throughout our program, we welcome people to type those in the chat or the Q&A. We'll try and respond to as many of those as we can. And with that, let me turn things over to Richard. Richard, take it away. It's all yours.
Hi. So welcome, as we said, to the Ukraine War 2022 Q&A session. And sort of just to sort of put out the rules, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not an academic. And as you can hear from everybody here, none of us are academics. We're not classically trained in history, philosophy, religion, and the other topics that we're going to be discussing today. That said, we will provide the information from sort of a secular perspective, trying to analyze it from a historical perspective. And given the nature of the topic, we ask that everybody be respectful, but that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be interactivity. Please put your questions in either the Q&A or the chat. If they are questions related to something that somebody has just said, please put those in the chat, because I do read the chat. If there's sort of just questions that have come into your head for whatever reason, please put those in the Q&A. That way I can begin to organize those for the panel period. And the way that this is going to work is that there's going to be a short presentation, probably around 30, 40 minutes, discussing the history of Ukraine over the last 400 years or so that got us to this point. And then we'll have a discussion with the panelists where we can answer some more relevant and pressing questions concerning this war and how it's been progressing. And just like the previous session, which was 3.5 hours, this will be recorded so you can watch it later. You can also watch any of the other recordings that our group History Mostly Ancient has put together. I've been doing a Middle Eastern history series, for example. We're going to have our 32nd episode on Thursday. There's a European Union series that I do with Aaron about security issues in the EU. There's a series about ancient Rome. We do all kinds of different discussions, and we encourage you to watch our offerings, all of which are offered as well on the New York Culture Group. So the thing that we have to realize is that we had this migration of Slavs first from what's now the Ural Mountains area into Eastern Europe. And those Slavs spread out into different areas. But what we care about for the discussion here are the Eastern Slavs. And the Eastern Slavs begin to settle throughout what's now Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and they become a number of different tribal peoples. Starting in Kiev, these different tribes begin to decide that they want to confederate under a unitary government. And so they bring in the Varangians. The Varangians are sort of the civilized version of the Vikings, right? They're coming from the same Norse region. They come down the Dnieper River and they settle in Kiev. And so they create this sort of alliance between them as rulers and the Slavs as the general people, because they can all agree to allow these foreigners to rule them as opposed to their own sort of domestic situation. Now, this confederation expands throughout Ukraine, Belarus, most of Russia. You can see on the map in the lower left-hand side, or the map sort of towards the center in pink, the amount of territory that was part of this Kievan Rus confederacy. Now, it's important to remember that this Kievan Rus is the progenitor of almost all the modern Eastern Slavic cultures. It's the progenitor of Russian culture. It's the progenitor of Belarusian culture. It's the progenitor of Ukrainian culture. All of these are coming out of Kievan Rus, but all of them sort of see Kiev as the center of where this historical development occurred. Do any of our panelists want to make a quick comment on this?
So they're called Varangians by mostly Russians, and the history of it was that was actually presented to us by one of the monks in the 1100s, that they were invited by Slav tribes to unite Slavic tribes because they were kind of all discombobulated, and therefore they actually related to the Swedish bureaucracy of Vikings. And Kievan Rus is considered to be first Viking state, believe it or not, that was created. Before that, there was no Viking state. They were all mostly, living as a tribal society. Just want to add that. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit. So Kiev was the center and the dominating state between starting from 9th century till the end of the 11th century. At that time, it started to decline. And especially after the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Constantinople was sacked, it went into complete decline. So the center of gravity for the Eastern Slavs started to move toward the northeast in the Vladimir Suzdal area. You see on the lower map, Suzdal, and in this area, that's where the Moscow originated. And the official date is 1147, when Prince Yuri Longhand built the wall around the settlement. And later on, in the beginning of the 13th century, Moscow started to descendant of the son of Alexander Nevsky, who was the most prominent Prince of Novgorod at the time. He became Prince of Moscow, and Moscow started to rise. Mostly, it started to be dominating in the 14th century and eventually in the 15th century under Ivan III, the grandfather of Ivan the Terrible. It became an independent state, specifically in 1480, and from there on, that's the rise of Russia and the beginning of the Russian national identity.
If I may add just a bit, I see that a lot of you spell Kiev as K-I-E-V. So here's the proper perspective. Kiev is how you say Kiev in Russian. In Ukrainian, you would say Kyiv. So the proper spelling would be K-Y-I-V. It would make you smarter by a factor of 10, and you can brag about it with your colleagues. And also a little known fact that the Vikings who had descended from the north, in our history, and I got my education in Kiev, and the first prominent figure was Rurik, the troublemaker who had descended from the north. And little known fact that the Ukrainian coat of arms is a trident, and from what I've been told, it was Rurik's coat of arms as well. And little bonus points on that trident, you can actually spell out Ukrainian word will. So Ukrainians are very, very popular for will. It's all about will.
So there are a couple questions that have sort of come up in the chat in the sort of period here. The first one is, what is the definition of a Slav? A Slav, there's a certain set of languages that sort of fit together from the Indo-European tree that branch off, and these are Slavic languages. And these groups of people primarily exist in what's now Central and Eastern Europe, right? Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia are what are called Northern Slavs or Western Slavs. You have the portion that's in the Balkans area, that's your Croats, your Bosnians, your Slovenians, your Serbs, your Macedonians, your Bulgarians. These are what are called Yugoslavs or Southern Slavs. And then you have your population in the East. That's your Belarusians, your Ukrainians, your Russians. These are the Eastern Slavs. So it's So it's that situation. And somebody made a comment that Ukraine should be Swedish. In many cases in Europe, people were ruled by monarchs that came from a foreign dynasty, right? We have to remember the House of Windsor that rules the United Kingdom right now is actually the House of Saxe-Gotha. It's a German dynasty. So it's very common for the kings of European states to not be from ethnically the same background as the people they rule over. And the Slavs formed a coalition with these Norse peoples, primarily because they were an outsider people, right? That way it wouldn't be one of the Slavic groups overruling all the other ones. And these groups, the Varangians, were relatively well organized. So it ended up working well for this unity. All right. Then we get to moving forward by about 600 years, we get to the point where you have this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And you can see that this hybrid state between Lithuania in the eastern parts and Poland in the southern and western parts began to take over significant portions of the east. And you can see it extends all the way into that hashed area, including the one controlled by the Lipko rebels. So a significant portion of western Ukraine today was under the control of Poland, including the city of Kiev. Now, what you begin to see at the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in that last 100 years between 1690, let's say, and 1790, is that you have groups of Cossacks who are speakers of an Eastern Slavic language, right? So they're not speakers of Polish. They're speakers of a different language, and they begin settling in large numbers in this area that's now Ukraine. And they consider themselves Cossacks. And the Cossacks come together to create their own government called the Zaporozhian Host. And the Zaporozhians fight against the Polish to attain some sort of independence. Sometimes they fight on the Ottoman side against the Poles. Sometimes they fight against the Russians, supporting the Poles. There becomes a lot of tension in the region as the Zaporozhians try to create more independence for themselves. Do any of the panelists sort of want to comment on this period and sort of the creation of the first sort of Ukrainian independent-minded polity in sort of this fracturing of Europe?
Yeah, if I'd like to fill the blanks briefly. Of course, there was a period of Mongolian domination starting from the first invasion in 1237. And then second 1240, that's when the Kiev was destroyed. And most of the Russian cities, Eastern Slavic cities, were destroyed at that period, except maybe only Novgorod, one of the major cities that had an agreement and was subjugated peacefully. So it started to develop afterwards. And then when the horde started to fragment and weaken in 15th century in particular. So that was the time when Lithuania started to expand, and the famous in Lithuania Prince Gediminas conquered Kiev in 1321 or 24. And from there on, Lithuania became a country from Baltic to Black Sea, had huge territory. However, the problems with an expansion of Russia made Lithuania made a pact with Poland, eventually through the marriage of Prince Jagiello and Princess Jadwiga. And that's how this Commonwealth was originated. It was also to resist the advance of the Teutonic and Livonian Knights from the west. And that's how we come. One point I would like to make, there is a very major problem between Russians and Polish. And even in current conflict, you could see that Poland is the greatest supporter of Ukraine right now. They have a border, and that happened during the Russia had only two dynasties, Rurik and Romanov, and there was a dark times in the beginning of the 17th century, between 1598 and 1613, where the question of Russian Tsardom was in question, and the Polish used 3 fake Demetrius, which is a deceased son of Ivan the Terrible, and took over Moscow for a period of time. So that is something that created a great enmity. It was when in 1613, the Romanov dynasty was restored, not restored, elected, was created new dynasty. It started to continue the expansion. And here we come to the point where I think very important period of Bogdan Khmelnytsky in the middle of the 17th century started the uprising. The Cossacks mainly served as a buffer of both Russia and Poland against the Crimean Tatars. But he started for the fight for independence, and eventually it was independent from Poland. And he asked for help from Russian Tsar Alexius Romanov. And as a result, in 1654, there was an agreement made in the city of Pereyaslav that for that help, eventually Ukraine became part of Russia. So it was kind of a takeover. And from there on, most of the Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. And that's the claim that now Putin is making, that this is one nation and same people. Okay.
And one other interesting, I think, note that's lost a lot in history is that there was an attempt to basically make the Republic of Three Nations, which is the Polish, Lithuanian, Ruthenian Commonwealth, and those Cossacks. So they were fighting them in the 1840s and 50s, but then at the same time offering ultimately to construct a new Commonwealth in essence, or a new republic with them, which obviously would have been pretty transformational from a historical perspective. So any of you into sort of counterfactuals or sort of history on you or whatever, I would recommend people really dig into the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, not just because I said it, but I think it's a very underappreciated period in history. Arguably, it's the most, they were the most ecumenically diverse religious set of republics in human history until the United States. When you look at the broad spectrum, I mean, it was almost every denomination of almost any religion was welcome there, as long as you obviously paid, tributes and so on. And they had a limited tiering. They still had a tiering system, but it was very limited. And for that era, it was, arguably freedom of religion.
And just to put it in context, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had the largest population of Jews of any European state. It also had significant Muslim populations. So it wasn't just Catholics and Orthodox who lived there. You had a number of different religious minorities.
And even on the north, you had obviously lots of
pagans.
Pagan, hybridist pagans, who basically over time converted into variant Christian denominations or constructed them. I mean, so it was it's really a phenomenal place and period. And when you look at the world, when you go back in history and you say, where would you like to live for a period of time that you could probably get away with not being that oppressed, it was a reasonably, as long as you weren't there during the variant partitions and destructions, it was a reasonably peaceful and definitely a freeing place. And back then we have to realize religion and freedom was the major freedom. That was the major suffrage that people sought, or at least attempted to try to construct around when they sought freedom.
Yeah, although the Protestants had less religious freedom. Anyway,
Sure.
if we go to the the Zaporozhian host to the Cossacks, they begin to develop their own sort of government system. This is called the Zaporozhian Sich, and it became the center of the Cossack world. If you've seen on the news, for example, that there was a power station in Zaporozhia, it's actually very close to where this location is. And this was built, as you can see, on the river. This is a recreation of the siege. And it began to try and make different kinds of alliances in order to assure that it would maintain some sort of independence. For example, right, you have Hetman being the supreme commander, Petro Doroshenko. He allied with the Ottomans in order to keep the Poles out. You have Ivan Mazepa, who was probably the last really independent ruler of the Zaporozhian Sich before it became part of Russia. And you have a number of battles that are fought between people that we can anachronistically call Ukrainians and Russians, or anachronistically call Ukrainians and Polish. So does anybody want to talk about eventually how in 1775, the Zaporozhian Sich was simply annexed by Catherine the Great to Russia, and about this period?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I wanted to add the Hetman Mazepa. In Russian culture, he is considered to be a great traitor who tried to drive Ukraine away from Russia and sided with Swedish King Charles XII, and eventually that was stalled after the Battle of Poltava. In 1709, the Russians won the battle, and Charles actually escaped to Turkey, I think. So that's that part I just wanted to add. About this integration, I let someone else to at the time of the Catherine the Great to continue. But Russians considered Ukraine actually has been part of Russian Empire from that period, officially of 1654, and that's probably they were called at that time Little Russians, and I can see that a lot of Ukrainians resent these kind of ideas, especially nowadays.
I was going to say, Daniel, could you give a little bit of context for what life as a Cossack was? And a number of both the panelists and I think the people watching are Jewish as well. And so, of course, there's sort of the negative view of the Cossacks from this period. Can you sort of give us a little bit of light about that?
Richard, you were just reading my mind because I was just thinking that I want to talk about it. So for all of you who are interested, think of Zaporozhia Siege, which is presented on the bottom left picture. It's a safe haven. It's an island, it's secluded, and the Dnipro River in that region is very hard to navigate because of a lot of rocky formations. So not only you had kind of like this natural defense system, you also had people like the peasant boys fleeing their homes to join the siege, which is, think of the Brotherhood, think of the Spartans. It kind of had that in mind. And think of the Cossacks as, I think the most accurate representation of Cossacks was warrior monks, because obviously the siege was destroyed in 1775, and the picture on bottom right is a representation of it. But you can see kind of like different buildings, right? In the center, you had the church. So you had the priest, and all of the Cossacks would it's not only Sunday church, it's like everyday sermon. And also consider that at that time, like there was no public education. So if you wanted to get educated, you have to join the church. And all of the Cossacks who would go to the siege, they would get this education. So one of those buildings would represent, like a great hall with books, and people do get educated. And Zaporozhian Cossacks were notorious warriors. And what made them awesome, according to my history teacher, is, so at that time you had muskets, like single shot muskets, which would take eons to reload. So Cossacks were smart, and they created this battle formation where you had front row of like Cossacks shooting muskets, while simultaneously the second row behind them would reload those muskets and give them back in front. So like by doing that, they increased their rate of fire, and they were notoriously good. Also, they were good horse riders, because in that region, it's the southern of Ukraine, which is steppe. So you have a lot of horses, you have a lot of plains, and you can, train yourself on how to ride a horse. And the weapons that Cossacks used for melee was, I don't know what it's called in English, but it's called shabla, which is like a curved sword.
Scimitar.
Thank you. So obviously it was good on horseback because you have this momentum and you just, slicing and dicing your enemies. And also the one thing that I want you to pay attention, if you would go back to the previous slide, please. I want you all to pay close attention. And this is the stuff that we'll be talking later today. The Zaporozhian siege, the independent Zaporozhian Ukrainian government, if you were so call it, is right in the middle. So it's always been, I just want you to pay attention geographically that Ukraine has always been like this buffer zone between the West and the East, split right along the Dnieper River. So to the West, you have Western ideals, you have Christianity, Catholicism, you have Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And to the East, you have completely different culture. You have the Ottoman Empire, you have the Crimean Khanate, the Mongol Tatars. So it's completely different lifestyle, completely different religion. And Ukraine has always been, right in the middle of it. And if you read Ukrainian literature from that period, again, I would encourage you all to read Taras Bulba by Gogol. Incredible read. If you do not want to read, there is a great film with incredible cast. I will share it later about Taras Bulba. However, like if you read the literature, Ukrainian literature of that time, you can clearly see that obviously, yes, Zaporozhian Cossacks were fickle. They would band up with Polish-Lithuania against Ottomans, or like they would band up with Ottoman Empire against Polish-Lithuania, or they would band up with Russians against everybody else. But the idea being the Cossacks really, really valued their independence well. And it was a situation where they were like against them all. It's us, it's our tribe, it's us Cossacks against the world. So, and if you're against the world by yourself, time to time, you would need those alliances.
Absolutely. I would also like to add for the Jewish listeners, one of the main reasons that the Cossacks attacked the Jews was that the Jews were the tax collectors and the physical representatives of the Polish-Lithuanian government. So while they couldn't attack, for example, the government in Warsaw or in Vilna, they could attack the Jewish tax collectors that were near them. And so that became sort of a proxy for that. And so that's why in a lot of Jewish history, there's a lot of negative association with the Cossacks because of this power relationship. All right.
Yeah, can I add? There was a question about Mazepa. The dates that represented was the dates when he was the hetman, but he was born in 1639, and it was in 1708 when he was displaced as hetman. That's when he sided with Charles XII of Sweden and participated in the Battle of Poltava, which is a major battle in 1709 in the summer. Participated against Russians, and then eventually later on he died. But Ukraine stayed within the Russia after that.
Right. Now, one of the things that Greg mentioned, and I think is actually worth taking a moment to sort of focus on, is that after the Russians forced the Mongols out of Russia, they had this fear that something from the east, like the Mongols, would come back. And so you have this massive Russian expansion. And you can see by this map all the different iterations of Russian expansion. Russians expanded from Moscow outwards. And so they took significant portions of land. This doesn't even get to, in the 1600s, how far into Siberia they expanded, right? Because by the 1700s, Russia already had expanded to the Pacific Ocean. But you can see there's two general movements where Ukraine is concerned. There's a movement towards the west and there's a movement towards the south. And so Ukraine comes right into the crosshairs of this Russian expansion. In particular, it's the fact that Peter the Great, who became the ruler of Russia in 1682, really wanted a warm water port. And eventually he gets a warm water port in Northern Europe. That's St. Petersburg. You can see it on the picture there. But what he ends up really wanting is a warm water port in the south, on the Black Sea, which means directly entering Ukraine. And Peter the Great transforms Russia from being a sort of, let's say, Eastern style state. It had a lot more in common with Mongol style of government, to something a little bit more westernized. But even still, there's that divide between Russian culture and Western culture. And as that expansion went on, he had to remove the nobles, the boyars, and increase power more locally, leading to numerous revolts from the established bureaucracy. Of course, the fact that he was moving into Ukraine also meant that he was attacking the bureaucrats there. Finally, in 1696, he wins a battle against the Crimean Khanate, which was a Muslim government of Tatars, Turkic people who controlled Crimea. The Crimean Tatars still exist today. They're a minority in Crimea because of deportations since this point. But as the Russians were pushing further south, they created their first fortress, Taganrog, which is in sovereign Russian territory today, not very far from Mariupol, which you can see on the map on the Ukrainian side of the border. And the Russians celebrate this Battle of Azov, where they entered the Azov Sea to take Taganrog, and it became their first warm water port. This actually preceded St. Petersburg by about 10 years, 10, 15 years. And it became sort of the central point that Russia wanted Black Sea ports in order to be able to field their warm water navy. Do any of the panelists want to discuss a little bit about this, or should we move forward?
Just the official date of St. Petersburg's foundation is 1703.
Nice. So actually less than 10 years. All right. Now, as I mentioned, Russia is pushing down into Ukrainian territory. And so what we end up having is, I want to compare these two maps side by side. If you look at the map on the right-hand side, you can see this area that's sort of in a red outline with pink in the center. And unfortunately, I can only find one that's in Russian. And it says Zaporozhia. That is the area of the Zaporozhian Siege. You can also see, if you compare that to the map of Ukraine on the left-hand side, that's the area with only small Russian population, because those percentages are percentages of Russian population in Ukraine, ethnic Russian population. But if you compare the areas that are in the Crimean Khanate, the areas that were part of the Russian Empire, that's that green area, you see that the Russian population is significantly larger. Another point to make is that the area in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that's that blue area, the Rich Pospolita, if you can read the Russian, is almost all Ukrainian population, right? You don't have Russian settlement there because the Russians don't enter that area until a century later. So you can see the settlement population in modern Ukraine today parallels this exact history in terms of when those people were deposited.
Hey, Richard?
Yeah.
A question, if you don't mind. Regarding this is obviously a modern map. With these provinces in the east with these percentages, there's a distinction between ethnic Russians and people who may speak Russian but consider themselves Ukrainian.
Sure. I would say that, I would actually say that those terms are not distinct. What I would say is the differences between people who are Russian ethnically and people who are Russian nationals, right? People who believe that they are loyal to the Russian government. And until 2014, I think that you can make a colorable claim that a significant percentage of Ukrainian citizens who are ethnic Russians in this region would have been in favor of becoming part of Russia. They would have been Russian nationals. With this current war and the way that Russia has treated Ukraine, that sentiment has completely disappeared, more or less. And so there's really no desire by ethnic Russian Ukrainian citizens to renounce Ukrainian nationality at this point.
One other point I'd like to make and bring into this is that what the status of slavery and serfdom was. So at this point, Russia, you could argue, was the world's largest slave state. So out of 13.5, 14 million people as population, between 13 and 14, somewhere between 10 and 11 million were in essence owned people. And then Peter the Great, 1723, converts, or Russia banned slavery and then converts them into serfdom. So basically writes a derivative contract on it, and and then you have this slow diffusion of serfdom as a percentage of the population, so that it gets to around 35 to 40% by the 1850s. But it is very, very slow because it's in essence generational. And so that's something to recognize, because it, I think, frames it's very important to recognize the incredible Central Asian influences when it comes to people, when it comes to the power of the state, when it comes to resources, that I think is there. And I think that's something that is actually very much missed in the West when we study history. We get really trapped in sort of these hagiographic figures and the Russian Revolution, and that's it, right? We don't recognize all these other forces that have been, there for 700-800 years.
Absolutely. Now, there are sort of three questions that I'd like to quickly address. The first one is, what was the incentive for Russians to move into these areas? Basically, the Russian Empire had conquered these territories and displaced the people that were living there originally, because they didn't want the Crimean Tatars to continue being the majority of the people. And so they would induce Russians to move further south. And so they could only obviously do that in territories that they control, which is why these populations look this way. There's another question here as to whether Putin is making the case that Russian language should be the basis of Russian identity in these areas, and that's absolutely the case, right? That elision that separation that I'm making between a Russian national and a Russian ethnic person is not an elision that Putin is making. It's not a division that Putin is making. He's actually saying that they're the same thing, that if you are ethnic Russian, you should support the Russian state. And so his argument has been that these areas should become part of Russia. And finally, there's a question of what is the Ukrainian language? The Ukrainian language is a language that is an Eastern Slavic language, just like Russian or Belarusian are Eastern Slavic languages. There are some differences between Ukrainian and Russian. So there are some people who speak only Ukrainian, some people who speak only Russian that can understand each other. But think of it like Spanish and Portuguese, where the differences are enough, the majority of people can recognize you're speaking one, not the other. And there are a number of people who can't understand the other language. And finally, there's a question about what are boyars? Boyars were the Russian nobility at the time.
And I think this gets locked into this discussion that I think the media and general news just doesn't use the right language. But there's a difference between a revanchism and irredentism. So revanchism is like the political policy of regaining lost territory, whereas irredentism is the doctrine, right? The philosophy of in essence, annexation, because there's historic roots or ethnic roots or links, etc. And where this became really popular actually is in the 19th century in Italy, because obviously Italy was so well organized. That's a joke. But that there were so many Italian speaking districts spread all over the place. And so there was a sort of an explosion of irredentist policies or doctrines to try to construct policies to fuse together something akin to an Italian state. So So hopefully that helps people, or it confuses you more. I don't know.
So
I may I make a comments about the language because
Sure.
my understanding. So during the Soviet times, and I can attest to that. I lived there, and I've been to Ukraine many times. I have relatives there. The Russian language was a primary language through the whole Ukraine. So all the administrative functions, everything was done in Russian language. Everybody in Ukraine spoke Russian language. The Ukrainian language was taught as a secondary language. And again, people in the Western Ukraine were much more loyal, much more speaking Ukrainian language rather than people in the Middle and Eastern Ukraine. So this started to change, of course, when the Ukraine became an independent state, like over 30 years ago, but very slowly. You know, and there is a question about the ethnic Russians and the Russian-speaking people. It's very different because a lot of Ukrainians prior to 2014, ethnically Ukrainians spoke only Russian and very little of Ukrainian. And I'm mostly talking about not about the Western part of the country, but the middle part. Like, for example, let me tell you that I've been to Kiev in 2014, right after Maidan, like a few months after Maidan. And Kiev was a Russian-speaking city. You could say, you could hear Ukrainian speech there as well. But in my perception, it was mostly Russian, maybe 80% Russian. I mean, it's definitely changed right now because now there is a more affiliation, there is a sense. And I agree with Richard with regards to a lot of ethnic Russians right now in Ukrainian territory consider themselves Ukrainian citizens and don't want to be part of Putin's Russia. And so this is very complicated situation. Putin would love to, of course, extend it to all Russian-speaking people, but this is very confusing. I think he probably mostly means ethnic Russians and the area where, as you showed, ethnic Russians are prevailed, specifically Lugansk and Donetsk areas where the Russian were ethnic, where Russians were majority. But yeah, the language is a very complicated. It is rapidly changing to more Ukrainian use and more people speaking Ukrainian. For instance, you have to understand, and this is the President Zelensky was a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, and he was a actor who played in the movies in Russian language. The movie that the Servant of the People, available on Netflix right now.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that. We have a slide on
right. This is the Russian speaking, but now he is speaking Ukrainian only.
Yeah. All right. So if we move a little bit further into the future, right, we've left Peter the Great and the first settlements of what's now Ukraine by the Russians in the early 1700s. Ukraine becomes absorbed. As we mentioned, in 1775, the Siege is abolished, and Ukraine becomes a territory of the Russian Empire. But after World War I, you have this situation where Russia is not able to control the territories at the edges of its territory because of the Bolshevik Revolution, right? And so you have this civil war that's going on in Russia. So the regions at the edge begin to push for increased independence and autonomy. So you have this first Ukrainian People's Republic, which is the first modern independent Ukrainian state, and it survives for only 3 years, right until the Bolshevik Revolution sends its military and conquers it. That's actually what happened, the same thing in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. In the Baltics, they managed to stay independent, but most of these areas became reintegrated into the Soviet Union. And the point that's really interesting here is that you can already see the symbols of modern Ukraine being used, right? You have the trident, for example, and you can see in the lower right-hand side, this is the this is the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ended the war between the Russians and the Germans, because the Russians pulled out of World War I when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917. And so the Germans expanded their territory in terms of what they held in the East, and that allowed these states like Ukraine to become more independent. Now, one of the interesting things is that Ukraine was not left alone during this non-Russian period. You also had Poland becoming an independent state, and Poland at that time was led by President Josip Pilsudski. You can see him on the right-hand side. President is sort of a euphemistic title. He was more like a generalissimo. And his view was to create a large buffer state between the German Empire in the West and the Russian Empire in the East, in order to prevent Poland from being cut up again. And so his view was to create a multinational state. Now, if you look at the map of Poland, you can see a very dark burgundy area in the southeastern part of Poland. Those are Ukrainian areas that he annexed to his state in between 1918 and 1922 in order to expand his Poland and create a larger buffer state. Now, if you look the areas to the northwest of that are sort of in a lighter shade of burgundy, those are areas with majority Polish population. So you can see that he annexes a lot of territory in the east, both from what's today Ukraine and what's today Belarus, in order to expand his Polish state. There's a question as to who ruled Crimea right before Catherine the Great. The Crimean Khanate ruled it. But yeah. Which was a Turkic group of people.
Yeah, Tatars.
Tatars. Does anybody want to sort of discuss this sort of interwar period and Ukraine's first moments of independence or quasi-independence?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important to understand this Western Eurasian use of these borderlands as buffers. And those buffers, and in prior presentations, one that you just did the other day, Richard, on the Ottoman, Russian war number 13 in the 1850s, the fact that there's this need for, once Russia becomes a more modern and fully militarized state, and then the Western European powers, the English, the French, and the Ottomans, really, from a Mediterranean perspective, recognize that Russia is a player, and obviously you have the Habsburgs too, but that recognize that Russia is a player there, and that there needs to be these buffers, and this is all part of the Metternich peace sort of view of the world to try to maintain peace, which was blown by World War I. But I think after World War I, smaller regional states start to look to try to create those same type of buffers. And we can't underestimate what was going on, obviously, in Russia between 1916, 17, and all the way through the 1920s. And so, and given the fact that Poland had been partitioned and sort of disappeared 3-4 times already. The view was we need to create some buffer land space, and Ukraine sadly fits into that same range. And so I think that's something to never forget. And there's anyway. So I don't know if Greg or anyone else wants to dive in further. But.
Richard, may I just circle back? I think I'm reading the comments. There is a heated debate about language, and let me try to settle it once and for all. Language is just a way of communication, right? Language is much more, like, language means how we express our thoughts in writing or verbally. And so you understand, I saw that the next slide was about Holodomor, but before that, there was a period when the Soviets had established them. There was a group called Ukrainian Intelligentsia, which is sort of like Ukrainian Enlightenment, where you had poets, writers, writing specifically in Ukrainian language, which was prohibited by the Soviets. And guess what happened to them? They were either shot or sent to Siberia. So don't be surprised when you discover that the most spoken language in Siberia, apart from Russian, is Ukrainian. And Ukrainian, so I assume not a lot of people in this chat speak Ukrainian and Russian, but I think the best comparison between Ukrainian and Russian would be Italian and German. So Italian is beautiful language with melody, and you can sing, and it's what this language represents. So Italian is more like Ukrainian. Whether Russian is harsh, strict, we have a lot of r, sh sounds, so it's good for giving orders when you're on a battlefield. But it's a clash between languages that had been ongoing in perpetuity, because people who wrote in Ukrainian were perceived as inferior, which is not the case. If you read Ukrainian literature of that period, it's beautiful. It's great. The amount. I think there is a saying for every Russian adjective, there are like 3 or 4 Ukrainian adjectives. And Ukrainian, to me, I speak both. So as a context, I speak both. My first language is Russian, but Ukrainian is arguably just more beautiful. And in my humble opinion, I think Russians were just jealous.
Mark, you have your hand raised. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, Richard, thank you. Do you mind going back to the Polish map, the Second Republic?
The Polish map? Okay.
Yeah,
do you mind turning on your video?
Say again? Yeah, sure, I can start the video. If you look at the southeastern corner, where there was some Ukrainian population, when the Polish Republic was recreated after World War I, there were debates within the Poles whether they wanted to have an ethnically unified Poland or a multi-ethnic one like it had been before. And Pilsudski was, he'd won out, and it was the multi-ethnic model that went out. And in the southeast, these are mostly Ukrainian populated areas, at least in the countryside. You'd have certain cities like Lemberg, Lvov, Lviv, the same one, just 3 different names. That was mostly Polish and Jewish. I think, Richard, you could correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was up to 1/3 Yiddish-speaking Jews in that city, especially under the Habsburg.
Yeah, it was. I would say it was 17% Yiddish-speaking Jews over the entirety of Poland during Pilsudski's reign. Okay.
And the Poles actually suppressed Ukrainian nationalism during that period. They had some problems and some actual fighting. And just as the last one, when the Poles, that Polish island of Lvov, I'll say it in Polish, a lot of the Polish soldiers in World War II who fought under the British command were from that city. And when that area reverted to Ukrainian, they didn't have a home to go to.
Yeah, no, that's correct. And I want to sort of comment a little bit on Daniil's sort of language war thing. One of the points that sort of comes up is like, if they just spoke Russian, like, wouldn't they be fine being under Russian rule? And the language sure is a marker of different identity, but it's not the only marker of different identity. I think the aspirations of most Ukrainians in terms of the political allegiance of Ukraine, towards the West as opposed to towards the East, these kinds of things make it that they're not actually the same people who just happen to speak a different language, or the same people who've been co-opted, to want different things. These are 2 different groups of people with 2 different sets of aspirations. And I don't think the idea that they should be under one government because they speak the same language and they touch each other makes sense. And we wouldn't imply that, for example, in Ireland, where most people in Ireland speak English before they speak Irish Gaelic. But none of us would say that Ireland should become part of Britain again just because most Irish are English speakers. The argument just doesn't work.
And I think something to not forget or to be aware of is that literacy in Russia, given how long they had serfdom, and how slowly they went from serfdom to more modern sort of institutions. So you only had a literacy rate of around 25 to 30% at this time in the 1910s to early 20s in Russia, whereas in Ukraine, the literacy rate was 3 times as high. And so when you look at sort of evolution and language construction, you can see that is pretty linear across all language families. You see it between, and I always say this, that I speak American, not English. And I mean that actually. We use in the United States a much harsher, more slang-ridden, because we were, late to the English literacy race, and and obviously we've overcome a lot of it, but many times you don't overcome the idiosomatics because they work culturally. And so I think, to follow up on a lot of what Daniel was saying, those idiosomatics really matter over generations, over hundreds of years. I mean, you can obviously have a revolution.
If we could move forward a little bit, right? This is the Holodomor. And the Holodomor, we should understand this as an intentional famine. This is a point where in 1932 to 1933, you have the creation of these large-scale farms in Ukraine, the removal of the Ukrainian aristocracy is a strong word for it, maybe bourgeoisie, called the kulaks, who were killed in large numbers, and the farms that Ukraine has, and Ukraine is known for wheat growth. The wealth of this and the food quality was exported to Moscow, and Ukrainians were dying. You can see the numbers of deaths in Ukraine by month. And on the left side, you can see, this is a map that's written in Ukrainian, and you can see in particular the regions that had the highest amount of numbers of deaths in black, and the lightest numbers in that sort of pink. But even the light ones in pink, we're talking about tens of thousands of deaths in those regions. So in particular, you can see in the upper left-hand side, that's Kiev, Cherkasy, and Poltava. So we have Ukrainians really developed, in addition to their national experiment from 1918 to 1920, they developed a sense of differentiation from the Russians because of the way that their livelihoods were uprooted during the Holodomor. Does anybody sort of want to comment on this, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this was a direct consequence of collectivization, that Stalin decided to stop what Lenin installed as a new economic policy and start the collectivization, and that led to this horrible consequences. So we're talking about millions of people who died. And actually Russians were encouraged to repopulate later on these areas, ethnic Russians.
Somebody mentioned Stalin in the comments. This was during the beginning of Stalin's reign, so this was a direct effect of Stalin in Ukraine. Mark, you wanted to add something?
If a question, if you don't mind. I'm astounded sometimes by the Russian nationalists who just deny this whole thing happened, or deny that it was a policy. They'll say things like, "Oh, lots of people starved in the Soviet Union. This is nothing special." And I'm curious, how is that equivalent to Holocaust denial?
No, I would say it's much closer to Armenian genocide denial. Holocaust denial is usually that it didn't happen, right? If you talk to the Holocaust denier, they'll say maybe 100,000 people died. There were diseases in the camps. The number 6 million is absurd, right? That's Holocaust denial in a nutshell. Armenian genocide denial is, oh, it totally happened, but there is a lot of really great reasons for it to have happened. And it's much closer to that, right? Oh yeah, a lot of Ukrainians died during the Holodomor, but Russians were dying too, right? We had these mass programs under Stalin. Lots of people were dying. There wasn't any intentionality to it. When you can see that if you just took the amount of grain that Ukraine was growing and you just fed that to the Ukrainians, you wouldn't have had this famine at all, right? If you didn't remove the kulaks and execute them in large numbers, you wouldn't have had the level of disorganization in Ukraine that would have that led to the Russians' ability to export that grain, right? Because without that sort of established leadership, then the Ukrainians had nobody to rally around, right? And they were repressed by Stalin's government and all these kinds of things. So the Holodomor only works as a way to kill off large numbers of people if it is intentional in terms of its execution style.
Yeah. And I also I sort of view this as a fusion, right? It's sort of the Armenian genocide meets the Great Leap Forward, right? So I always sort of view this as Great Leap Forward 1.0, or the MVP, where they basically attempt to sort of collectivize and dehumanize the agricultural life cycle. In essence, just looking at human beings as sort of, another physical or mechanical input, and, forgetting the fact that you're not beating nature and you're not beating humans' needs to be productive on the soil. And so there is sort of a fusion of these two things. And then this dynamic that goes on in modern Russian history, which is to love the state survival stories, which are legitimate in some ways. Some of the World War II stories around, winning the war or doing the majority of the winning of the war in Europe, and then sort of conflagrating all those other pieces of it and say, well, that's sometimes the costs you have, versus looking at these as separate contingent events that human beings obviously have control over.
All right. So you can see under the, if you look up actually at the upper right-hand side, you can see this is a street in Kharkiv during the Holodomor, and you can see on the sidewalk, there are two people literally passing out from their lack of food, just dying of starvation. And you can see that negativity towards the Russian control manifesting during World War II, right? Because now we have this opposite force. You have Nazi Germany that is able to push Russia out of Ukraine. And there's certainly individuals, especially, Stepan Bandera, who lead Ukrainians in sort of either creating an independent Ukraine or nationalist Ukraine in alliance, quasi-alliance with the Nazis. And you had positive receptions, especially in the westernmost parts of Ukraine, towards the Nazi invasion, because they saw it as a way out of the Soviet system. The pro-Nazi sentiment generally went down as time went on, and as we'll cover in the next slide, the pro-Soviet response in terms of numbers dwarfed the number of pro-Nazi sympathizers. But when we see Putin making the argument that he's denazifying Ukraine, he's pulling upon this kind of imagery. Does anybody want to talk about this period in Ukrainian history, the sort of the pro-Nazi or pro-independence, however you want to phrase this, view of Ukraine?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. So Stepan Bandera, was a Ukrainian nationalist, and he collaborated with Germans up until a certain point, and that is made him a symbolic figure, identifying him with Nazis. Though when he wanted to declare the independence of Ukraine under German rule, he was arrested by Germans and sent to a concentration camp. However, the Russian propaganda right now basically saying that there are elements from the Western Ukraine, and specifically the battalion called Azov, that committing genocide, that they're basically controlling the government, controlling Zelensky, and doing, I mean, the propaganda in Russia is horrendous. They're basically saying that all those pictures of cities, destroyed cities, are fake, and some of them are just being destroyed by the Nazis just for the show, just to get an idea what level of lie is going on in Russia right now. And a lot of people do believe that, unfortunately. So But that's basically became a symbol of rights, extreme rights nationalists. Stepan Bandera, and a lot of things done against him, kind of his followers.
Let me just add a couple of things. Sorry.
Yeah.
Apologies. So Stepan Bandera and Shuhevich, initially did collaborate with Nazis, but Nazis had or Germans had no aspirations to make an independent Ukraine. They actually thought of Ukrainians and Russians as slaves. That's what's the determination is, and in fact, you got disillusioned at the end. So Ribbentrop, the minister of propaganda in Germany, had used Bandera as his ploy to then show, like, look, I have this Ukrainians that collaborating with us and can fight on our side. And in fact, there was a lot of Russian collaborators, like, for example, General Vlasov, who defected after being encircled to Germans. And there was a Russian battalion that's probably even much bigger than the Ukrainian battalion that fought when Polish were trying to break out from Germany in 1944 on the German side. But Germans never trusted Ukrainians or Russians and never used them in battlefield, only used them as a police or collaborators in the camps, and therefore it was never something that that would have materialized in independent Ukraine. And he realized that, and then start fighting against Germans. Obviously, I'm talking about Stepan Bandera, but in not Russian eyes, he's considered to be, they call it Nazi, which is what they're calling Ukrainians right now. And they call this campaign denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine, which is completely false. They have a Jewish president, Zelensky, and therefore this completely debunks the whole idea that Russia is trying to propose. Thank you.
I was going to ask, Daniel, could you sort of comment on how modern Ukrainians see these sorts of leaders, whether there's a division between East and West Ukraine in this perception? What do these people represent to modern Ukrainians?
To be completely honest with you, and again, objective, this period has been omitted in Ukrainian history book. It's not, really being talked as much for, obvious reasons. However, even let's talk even pre-2014, before even Russia annexed Crimea, the collaboration between, the government is in Kiev, which is, center of Ukraine, and west of Ukraine has been always strong, because you have to think about cultural ties. And to Ukrainians in Kiev, like, you would find, like, the most, if you would open up your Wikipedia and Google Ukrainian, you would probably see pictures of Ukrainian from the western parts of Ukraine. So we talk Lviv, and we talk Precarpathia, and all of the regions that surround Carpathian Mountains. My grandpa, he is from Kamenets-Podilsk, which is Khmelnytskaya Oblast, and actually it's not really black and white, and he was 11 when the World War II broke out, and actually Nazi killing squads visited his village and just murdered all of the villagers, and he was just hiding, and that's how he survived. So it's not all really black and white, and I would encourage you to think of Ukrainian Nazi collaboration like collaborations that happened 400 years ago, where we had Zaporozhian Cossacks collaborating with Ottoman Empire against Polish-Lithuanian government, where the Cossacks collaborated with Polish-Lithuania against Russia, or with Cossacks collaborated with Russia against them all. So it was just a means to an end, because Ukrainians had been, oppressed. Ukrainian intelligentsia, either sent to gulags or exterminated. And as you said, Richard, they were looking for this, catalyst for Stepan Bandera to propel them to like create maybe an independent state. And if you go to, I would encourage, after the world ends, I would all encourage you to go to the Western Ukraine and, think for yourself and make your own decisions and try their great cuisine, which is phenomenal. And actually, Stepan Bandera is considered as a hero, even up to this day. And as Aaron said, Putin uses, one of the Putin's agenda and reasons for invading Ukraine is denazification. So he honestly thinks that there are Nazis in Ukraine, which is not true. At least I haven't seen them. And Putin thinks of Stepan Bandera as Nazi, and he thinks that there are still Nazis in Ukraine. However, the case is it was just, a one-time deal for Ukrainians to gain their independence in the 40s.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and a couple quick things to sort of not forget is that there's a great book, a great historian, Timothy Snyder, that wrote about the Bloodlands. And we have to recognize that this whole region was the Bloodlands. And so you had, roughly, I think the estimates are around 15 million people over a 12 to 15 year period were killed. And obviously tens of millions of people were forced down, radical migration patterns and so on. And you have to put this in context, like the Taiping Revolution, a rebellion. And obviously that was much bigger, 3-4 times bigger, probably in terms of death toll. And so when you have this much destruction over a compressed period of time, human beings just think of just survival. And it doesn't justify anything. And obviously, when you look back, from a historical perspective, you recognize these decisions. But one that no one really talks about is that the Finns, in Finland, supported versus the Finns in Sweden, right? The Finland supported the Germans because obviously they were fighting a period of conflict with the Soviet Union and Russia, and so, or SSR, and so you had these strange bedfellows that were constructed during that period, and this was definitely one. I do think, and this is the last quick point here, that today's iteration of this, and I've spent a decent amount of time in Ukraine doing IT work and working with people there for years in the late 2000s and through the 2010s till about 2017, 18. And I like soccer. And so going to a lot of football matches, especially towards the East, the concept of an ultra, if any of you know that, which are big in Italy and in many countries, this sort of fusion between ultraism and the right-wing nationalism and a sort of local tribalism is very tight. And so, I think you want to, for any of you that understand what that is, you want to see that confluence, and generally speaking, a lot of young men. And so you want to see that confluence as the major population that's driving this versus what you would see like in the West, like Kiwanis clubs, or Boy Scout, Girl Scouts, you don't have that type of infrastructure. And so it's very different, and I'll post a link here that goes into that a little bit, which for any of you, want to understand more. To be blunt, you could say Ukraine has had an own goal on this for 10, 20 years. They really should have taken a more German approach to this and really stamped this down because it did create a lot of sort of negative feedback. And even Finland has, which I don't know if a lot of you know this. I'll put this link in here, that Finland finally dropped 2 years ago the swastika inside their Air Force emblem, which is obviously nobody was paying attention to that in the last 70 years. But
can I make a quick
yeah.
point about the Nazi groups? I mean, there is a Nazi element in almost every country. There are some in the United States, as you know, extreme right nationalists, Nazis. There are some in Russia, and there are some in Western Ukraine. The main point of the Russian propaganda right now is distorting the reality. And there are some footage and interviews with those Nazi elements in Western Ukraine that are quite insignificant, but they do exist. And they, of course, participate in the defense. And the Russians trying to present them as if they are dominating the whole government. That's the idea.
Yeah, I was just going to say, before just to close out this portion, people have asked about the two marches. The march in 1941 was to welcome the Nazi soldiers. The march on the right is by those who support Stepan Bandera, and that golden lion is his symbol. And so in the view of those who are worried about Stepan Bandera's connection with the Nazis, about that return, that's similar to a pro-Nazi march, and that's sort of the connection that people are making. But as I pointed out before, the pro-Soviet side of Ukraine was significantly larger. We're talking about 4.5 million Ukrainians fought on the Soviet side of the war. And you have that being meant, we have that sort of represented in a number of different forces. And they weren't just fighting in the Soviet army. For example, we have on the upper right-hand side, you can see General Władysław Anders of the Polish army. He had tens of thousands of Ukrainians in his forces. Ukrainians fought in the US forces, in the British forces, in the Canadian forces. In fact, there's probably not one ally that fielded an army greater than 100,000 people that did not at least have some Ukrainian volunteers. Additionally, the largest segment of Ukrainians that fought as partisans. And so you can see in the lower right-hand side, this was a village priest in Ukraine who was awarded from the Soviets a second-class medal for his work in fighting against the Nazis in Ukraine. You also have, especially since Ukrainian independence, an increasing view towards the contextualization of the Holocaust in Ukraine. For example, during the Soviet period, you had Babyn Yar, which was the area where the largest number of Jews died in a single event. It was 31,000 Jews, a little bit more, died in this field. They were killed in one day by the Einsatzgruppen, which were the deployment task forces of the Nazis. This was before the concentration camps became the dominant form of execution. During the Soviet period, this was recognized as a place where Soviet citizens had died. Not as a place where Jews were intentionally exterminated, but the independent country of Ukraine has begun to recognize that it was Jews in particular who suffered. And so they created this modern memorial that you can see Zelensky offering a token of appreciation at. You can also see the development within the Soviet military. Ukrainians were generally organized into Soviet units. They weren't ethnically or nationally separate. That said, there were several nationally separate units for a minority of Ukrainians in the Soviet military, the 1st through 4th Ukrainian fronts. And this is a picture of the 1st Ukrainian front. That flag is still in Kiev that represents the Ukrainian front. Do any of our panelists want to comment on this period? Okay. Yeah, and Daniel mentions that Babyn Yar was destroyed by bombardment a week ago. Yeah.
So Richard, just to clarify, that picture with Zelensky in the bottom left, you mentioned memorial near Kiev. So I'm actually not familiar with that. I think it's more.
No. It's a memorial at Babyn Yar.
Oh, in Kiev. So there is an actual Babyn Yar in Kiev, which is kind of like a valley where, you know, the Jewish population was slayed in World War II when the Nazis occupied Kiev. So when I said Babyn Yar Memorial in Kiev was destroyed in bombardment, I was referring to that one. I'm not sure if, because I think they to honor like an anniversary to honor that, I think they created a second one near Kiev, and I think that one is still intact, but do not quote me on that because I have not been to Kiev in 8 years.
Yeah.
Daniel, can I ask you to comment on your shirt? That's a national Ukrainian
this
shirt.
Is traditional Ukrainian garb called Vyshyvanka. This is new pizzazz. This is new this is new fashion. This actually belonged to my grandpa, and it's quite too big for me. But I thought it would be appropriate to wear it.
It looks nice, and it's apropos.
Thanks.
So,
hey Richard, why don't you unshare your screen for just a moment so Daniel can pull up his shirt, because it's hard to see because the video is so small.
We can do that during Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah. So after World War II, Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union again. It became Ukraine SSR. And the typical kind of repression that you see throughout the Soviet Union was visited on Ukraine. Nothing like the Holodomor, where it was a specific anti-Ukrainian government apparatus, but it was a government apparatus that was repressive. You did have people being sent to the gulags, especially any of those who demonstrated any Ukrainian nationalist tendencies. You had large-scale industrialization throughout southern Ukraine. And you had the security state run by the FSB, right, the Soviet secret services. So it was a very difficult life, but it was difficult in the way that it was difficult for most Soviets at that time. All right. So it's important to sort of point out how Ukraine has changed territorially, let's say in the last 100 years, right? So if we look at Ukraine, it's expanded westward, right? It's taken on territories that were previously part of Poland or part of Slovakia or part of Moldova or Romania. And so it has acquired those territories. Crimea came into Ukraine from Russia, right? Crimea used to be a Russian territory, but during the reign of Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow, it was given to Ukraine because it is a peninsula of Ukraine in terms of the landmass. And so it made more sense from an organizational administrative perspective to give it to Ukraine, even if the majority of the population were Russian, and it was an important Russian center in terms of the Black Sea Fleet. Because when you're in the Soviet Union, it didn't make any distinctions. Of course, post-independence, when that territory became part of a sovereign and independent Ukraine, the fact that Khrushchev was ethnically Ukrainian, the fact that the Black Sea Fleet is still at Sevastopol, which is a city on the Crimean Peninsula, all these things increased Russian nationalist fervor towards taking Ukraine and bringing it under Russian control out of Ukrainian control.
One little point, by the way, he gave Crimea to Ukraine, Khrushchev, in 1954, and that was to commemorate 300 years of unification of Russia and Ukraine, because if you remember, the agreement of the Pereyaslav happened in 1654.
Right. All right. So when Ukraine becomes independent, there becomes this very important question, right? You have in these 5 cities, along with a few others, but these are the 5 dominant ones. You have Russian nuclear missiles based in Ukraine, and that makes sense, right? Ukraine is a forward position of the Soviet Union. So naturally, if you're going to have missiles aimed at the United States, if you're going to have them aimed at Western Europe, they should be based in Ukrainian territory. And that's exactly what happened. You had a lot of these missile carriers you can see in the upper left-hand side. And in 1994, Bill Clinton manages to negotiate an agreement between Russian President Boris Yeltsin and Ukrainian President Kravchuk concerning the redeployment of these nuclear missiles to Russia in exchange for Russia, the United States, and I believe Western Europe having security guarantees for Ukraine that Ukraine would remain territorial independent. And this is called the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed at the end of 1994. Does anybody in the panel want to comment a little bit on the Budapest Memorandum?
I mean, I think one thing to recognize is that over 3/4 of these were theater, or what are termed as theater ballistic missiles. So they represent the majority of arms control that the U.S. and then the Soviets, and then obviously the last 30 years the Russians, which we've slowed down our ability to make progress on theater ballistic missiles. So in essence, the Russians, starting really in the early 2000s, have made a shift to recognize that the conventional imbalance is so substantial between the U.S. and Russia itself that maintaining a theater ballistic advantage is paramount. And at this point, the Russians have, best estimates are somewhere on the order at a theater level, probably 5-1 advantage in theater ballistic missiles at the collapse of the last generation of START agreements and the inability to get new nuclear arms control agreements. We've basically, I would say, mostly maxed out the long range ballistic missile treaties. I mean, you could push them down more, but now you're getting to such a parity with others like China, India, let's say maybe Israel, wink, wink, that Russia and the United States will likely not do that unless there's a new generation, historic generation of arms control. So this is actually, I think, very important for people to fully appreciate, because there's a lot of nuclear talk in the last month, and the Russians have been experts at let's say nuclear talk for going on almost 70, let's say 60 plus years, and they've figured out that in the West, and I would say the global West, culturally, we freak out every time they jump on the table and do sort of a Batman, Joker, Riddler smile and laugh and say nuclear a lot. And that doesn't necessarily translate into actions, because the actions count in the end, which is moving mobile, in their case, moving mobile launchers around, because that's what really matters at the end of the day. And so you don't see that connection, because they do recognize that changes the escalation dynamics pretty radically. And so I don't know, we can go into that later, but to keep it really simple, since we don't have theater ballistic missiles in the United States, the French and the English basically have some of those. The UK have I'd say a chunk of those. That would force us to escalate to basically intercontinental. So it just changes the whole escalation dynamic, because we have to basically go with our sub-base launches. Absolutely. And then that gets out of hand, obviously, pretty quickly.
So now one of the things that I sort of want to show is the development of Ukrainian dynamics after Ukrainian independence in terms of politics and organization. So in 2004, we have this period, from about 1990 till about 2014, we're operating in a certain a paradigm where you have Ukrainians who are westward looking and generally are trying to speak more and more of the Ukrainian language, and Ukrainians that are eastward looking and generally more interested in an alliance with Russia. And you can see from the vote in 2004 that almost all of those people who were eastward looking were living in those areas that used to be part of the Zaporozhian Siege, used to be part of the Crimean Khanate, and the parts that were part of the Ottoman Empire, the parts that were all settled by Russians moving south, right, or Cossacks moving south. And the areas that were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, almost all of those, or part of the Hetmanate, were those that voted for Yushchenko, who was more westward looking. And so you have this very interesting situation where, politically speaking, Ukraine looks like a country that's actually divided along this sort of Russian-Polish divide. But of course, that changes with the Euromaidan revolution in 2014. And the Euromaidan revolution is really a democratic, or rather, a failure of democracy occurring because of Russian intervention. And so Viktor Yanukovych, quote, won the election. He was a pro-Russian candidate. But in reality, the Ukrainians felt that this election had been stolen from them. And so they protested in Maidan Square against Russian military incursions, against Ukrainian military incursions by Yanukovych, supported by the Russians. And democracy won out. The Ukrainians were able to get their independence. Does anybody want to comment on Euromaidan?
Yes, please. Interesting time. I was there during that year. So just so you all understand, Viktor Yanukovych, pro-Russian, but he actually wanted to further Ukrainian alliance with the European Union, and there were talks about trade treaties or some sort of. However, overnight, the legend goes that he gets call from Putin, and overnight he changes his decision, pulls out, which just infuriates people. And this is how the Euromaidan started, because Yanukovych was like, people wanted, and you can even see European flags on this picture, European Union flags. So people were actually, and again, this is my perspective, I lived there during those times. People were fine with Yanukovych as long as he would further Ukrainian alliance with the European Union. But again, he pulled out last minute. People got infuriated, and Maidan is actually, think of like the lawn in DC before the Capitol. It's kind of like, it's that big, even bigger. So people started gathering, and out of 10 people, you had 100, and out of 100, you had 1,000. And that, lasted over winter of 2013 to 2014, which eventually led to Viktor Yanukovych fleeing the country and going to Russia.
Absolutely. And when Yanukovych went to Russia, Petroshenko was able to get the Ukrainian presidency and move in a more Western direction. Now,
prior to Petroshenko, there was a intermediate government, and that it was in that period when Putin grabbed the Crimea before the election, because the government was not entirely legitimate. It was like, and that's when he grabbed
it was the caretaker government.
And then Poroshenko was elected later on. But already the problem with Lugansk, Donetsk was going full scale, and the Crimea was lost.
Mm-hmm. All right, so there are a couple strategic things that I want to address before we get to the Q&A. And the first one is that Moscow has always been worried about invasion. And they've been worried about invasion, I think, because of the Mongol situation, but this is an invasion from the West. And you can see that there's a large plain that really narrows as you get closer and closer to Germany. But in Poland, in Ukraine, it widens to the entire height of Eastern Europe, and it's easily traversable. You can see the topographic map on the right-hand side, where it's basically flat throughout this entire area, which means that tanks can move effectively, and Russia wants to put the point at which that possible entryway can happen further and further west in order to prevent enemy forces from being able to move quickly across central Ukraine. The Nazis did it quickly. The Nazis did it quickly, and Napoleon did it quickly. So this is a constant fear from Russia, an invasion from the West. There was a quick question about how Poroshenko got power. There was an election. There was a legitimate election, and there was a vote for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's there's two things. One on the whole Euromaidan movement, because it was what you would call a revolutionary protest movement, I think that was a lot of the making of this friction that exists between the EU or European states and the EU, and Russia with Ukraine. It's almost, it shifted from a pure military or sort of humanitarian depopulation version, which was in prior centuries, to a purely political one until obviously recently in the last month. And I think that was this making of this dynamics between the EU and Russia. And to be honest, the response from the EU, was never, it was never fully welcoming Ukraine as a full state into the EU or attempting to. Even a place like Moldova is arguably has been more welcomed at a sort of a technical, it's what's called the ascension process in the EU at an ascension level. And it all boils down to the Russian dynamics, right? The European states don't have an answer on how to deal with a revanchist, more authoritarian, more militaristic Russia on their borders. And so the simplest answer is don't antagonize, don't engage, ignore the problem. Basically the root of most failed marriages is basically the construct of what goes on or has gone on. And I would argue, I give it a 50-50 that it'll go back to that steady state. I know that's not what maybe people want to hear or what people assume, but you're already seeing some of those fissures in Europe. All
right. So now we talked about the situation in terms of invasion. The possibility, of course, always existed for the growth of NATO, and NATO, you can see, has moved further and further eastward, closer to Moscow. Moscow has tried to counterbalance this with their own organization, the CSTO, of which Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan are all members. But you can see Ukraine on this map in that very crucial geopolitical position, geostrategic position, is a neutral party, and Russia deeply wants them to be part of the CSTO, while increasingly, especially after Euromaidan, Ukraine is looking closer and closer to Europe for its security guarantees.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about NATO, I think we need to be very clear about what we mean. NATO is in essence, a management organization to manage the security and defense of its members. And you could say there was original NATO, OG NATO, right, which is the NATO of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then there's this more expansive NATO, the NATO of the post Cold War. Yeah, of the end of the Soviet period of let's say the Cold War.
Now, there's another reason that we have expansion. We have Ukraine being more of an issue, is that Russia gets over 50% of its tax revenues from the exportation of the energy sector. It's over 54%. The energy sector is also nearly 70% of Russia's exports, and it adds a significant chunk to its GDP. Around 30% is from power. So you can imagine how important this sector is to Russia. And if you look at a lot of the pipelines flow through Ukraine, which of course during the Soviet period was not a problem. That was still part of the same state. But now Ukraine is charging tolls on that. And so Russia has been busy building these lines that now go through Belarus, that go under the North Sea and go under the Black Sea, anything to circumvent Ukraine so they don't have to pay these kinds of tolls. And I think energy is part of the rationale for this action. You can also see that there are oil deposits within Ukraine, both in the westernmost regions and in the easternmost regions, as well as under the Black Sea between Crimea and Odessa. And Russia would have a direct competitor in Ukraine for providing Europe oil and gas if these become developed. And in fact, Russia has actively worked to make the shale deposits in the east unusable because of the 2019 conflict in the Donbas. And European institutions were hesitant in 2012 to build on the shale gas deposits. In 2014, because of Euromaidan, a lot of them pulled out because they considered the country too unstable. And so this war could be seen as an effective way to keep Ukraine out of the energy market.
Yeah. And one other quick point about shale, I think it's very important to understand this. It's for those of you that have heard about it or have studied it in the last 15, 20 years, especially given the US and Qatar becoming, in essence, shale superpowers. Shale is unique in that it allows a much faster development process. So under normal large rig digging, 3 to 10 years, depends on the complexity. Shale, you can start getting real production going in 3 to 10 months. So there's a substantial, I would argue this is a colossal mistake in the EU in that they didn't, especially the Western region shale, they didn't develop it sooner. And I understand why, because of the Green New Deal and so on, but they never developed that hedge. And you could argue that Nord Stream 2 was really almost a version of not having to do that in continental Europe, or what they call continental Europe, basically.
Yeah.
Oh, can I make a couple of points about the NATO expansion? Because it's a major sticking point for Russians. And if you know, in negotiations before this invasion was about the Putin made demands that they would pull off completely of the Eastern Europe. And every Russian, basically, if you start arguing about this, would talk about the Russian grievances about the NATO expansion, specifically that they're saying that there was a verbal agreement between Gorbachev and I believe it was Clinton at the time. It was a verbal agreement about the reunification of Germany and the Berlin Wall collapse, that supposedly the Americans gave a verbal promise to Gorbachev that NATO will not move even 1 inch to the east. And that was actually confirmed in the interview by very famous Russian journalist Vladimir Pozner, interview with Gorbachev that's, I don't know, it was like maybe 10 years ago, where Gorbachev confirmed that. And that's what Russians are basically, it was, there was no official agreements or anything. I know that James Baker refuted that. He said, no, it didn't happen, but so you understand where the Russian, because all Russians absolutely believe that it was some kind of gentleman's agreement that West violated. I am personally of the opinion, knowing how much abuse the Eastern Europe suffered from Soviet Union, that they naturally wanted to join NATO for protection, and NATO couldn't say no. But it's a question. But just want to understand where the Russians are coming from, because they absolutely believe that there was an agreement, and Gorbachev did say it in the interview that there was a verbal agreement. I don't know how much that's worth, but it.
So to build on Greg, I think what's really important here, and we just forget about this, but that East and West Germany were separate, and the Germans, as the wall fell, because it was the wall itself between East and West Germany, and when we say the wall, that Germany wanted to have a reunification. And obviously Russia, the Soviet Union, which was still technically, it still existed at that point for another year or so, they were concerned about Germany rearming and, more importantly, becoming, in essence, let's say a NATO superpower. And so the discussion really, if we're going to be honest and objective about it, was built around the rubric of that reunification. And so I think, to be sort of fair and objective about it, I think the broadest understanding is that we were willing, and the Germans under Kohl at that point, the West Germans, I should say, were willing to really say anything to allow Germany to have its reunification. And I believe part of that saying anything concerned a German NATO expansion, right? I think that was the vantage point of sort of the Soviets and the Russians. They didn't think of Estonia, they didn't think of Moldova as being of paramount concern. They were concerned in the World War II German context of a rearmed superpower that would now become basically a peer adversary in Europe with Russia. And if we're going to be really fair about it, we sort of blew all this off in the 90s, to be honest. And we got a revanchist a leader in Russia who, in essence, kind of brought all that back up in the 2000s. And we just haven't been able to reconcile that. And ultimately, I believe what Putin is attempting to do, and the Russian leadership, I make this larger than Putin because it is larger than Putin. Because I think everyone believes Putin goes away, all these problems go away. Maybe the Ukrainian part of the conflict goes away, but the larger issues don't go away. And the larger issues is they basically want to renegotiate the European security architecture going forward in the 21st century for at least the next, let's say, 30 to 50 years. I mean, that's the bottom line. And so, however this conflict resolves itself, that doesn't change. The Russians will continue to want to renegotiate this architecture. And at the end, the Europeans, through us, the United States, are going to have to somehow square that circle with the Russians some point, whether it's 6 months from now or 12 years from now. At some point, something's going to have to give in that.
Now, there's another part that I want to sort of bring up in terms of the strategic reasons for Russia's invasion. And when Russia took Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, the Ukrainians cut off the North Crimean Canal. You can see illustrated by this image on the right-hand side, and in terms of its map position by the left-hand side. And the North Crimean Canal connects the Dnieper River to Crimea, because Crimea is basically a salt flat. It has no water of its own. It has no major rivers. And so this canal was constructed in order to bring water from Ukraine, which of course has significant amounts of water, is well irrigated, as we pointed out. It's a breadbasket, to Crimea. When Crimea was annexed by Russia, and therefore it was an independent country, the Ukrainians cut off the water. And so you ended up with these very shallow resulting areas in the North Crimean Canal. Prior to the Russian invasion, the reservoirs in Crimea were at 7% of total capacity, which should show you how close they were to dying off. And one of the first things that the Russians did when they invaded the city of Kherson, which is very close to that Nova Kakhovka on the map, was that they blasted open the blockade that the Ukrainians had put in order to get water flowing back into Crimea here.
Yeah, and to build on this, at a strategic or geostrategic standpoint, southern Ukraine and Crimea and Sevastopol are absolutely fundamentally strategic to Russia. And this goes back to 1783, the three great admirals, probably one of the greatest admirals in history, just the whole codification of the ability of Russia to project global power. I would argue this is the equivalent of Hawaii and Pearl Harbor to the United States and its ability to project power into the Pacific. And the Russians view this, and I would argue they're only going to reinforce this view, especially given that they've had obviously at this point, a catastrophic destruction of land forces, primarily through light combined arms, which was always their fear, right? Their fear is they could never compete with originally they believed just the United States and maybe some of the far Western allies like the UK and the French. But the idea that a, fairly lightly trained near Russia force can do a lot of, let's say, combined arms on the cheap, sort of proves the point that Russia's ability to rearm itself and retrain itself will have to be a generational effort. And they can't afford to do that on land because it takes time. And so they're going to have to shift to other power. And that's going to clearly be nuclear, it's going to be sea ballistic, et cetera, because that's something they actually can do.
Now, you're talking about the Black Sea position is critical in terms of if you see where Putin's troops were disposed before February 24th, when the invasion began. You can see the troop positions were in Russia proper, in occupied Crimea, and in Belarus. And you can see that there's the alliance, right, between Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko, the quote president, end quote, of Belarus. And you can see Volodymyr Zelensky. This is just before the invasion happened. And the picture of Volodymyr Zelensky is from his address to the Russians, the Russian people on the 23rd of February, trying to avoid the invasion. There's a question about the links for safekeeping. The easiest way to use the links, just click on them. They'll open them up in your Microsoft Edge or Firefox or Opera, whatever your web browser, Chrome, whatever your web browser is, and then you'll have it in your history. That's the easiest way to save the links. So we get to the invasion, and of course, people are all excited about who this guy is. You can see he starred in a TV show called Servant of the People, where down on his luck, normal person claiming to oppose corruption, gets elected to the presidency of Ukraine on a promise to end corruption. And then you can see the real person who's a common person in Ukraine, runs on an election to oppose corruption, gets elected on a premise to oppose corruption, and becomes president of Ukraine. So you can see life had absolutely nothing to do with this artistic portrayal and sort of creating his image. But in the same time, as president during this wartime period, he's made sure to wear fatigues, to look like he's in there with the soldiers. That's not to say that he isn't, but he's definitely making that appearance. And I think it's really important to point out how effective Zelensky has been from a marketing perspective in terms of creating this Ukrainian solidarity and creating this image of fighting and defending his homeland, very similarly to the way that Churchill, had his, they will bomb us in the streets, we will never surrender kind of speech. I think Zelensky has really figured out how to Instagram that kind of momentum. And yes, as people are pointing out, you can see The Servant of the People on Netflix now. So
they say they're going to address Oscar today.
There's a question of why did Putin wait until now? I think we can cover that in the period. So we also have to discuss Russia's foreign policy, and Russia's foreign policy with regards to the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union has to do with destabilizing any of the post-Soviet countries that have a westward orientation. And we can see that with the way that they've created Transnistria in Moldova, Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, supported Armenia's Nagorno-Karabakh region in Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is even only partially Western-leaning, and the creation of these two separatist regions, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, in Ukraine. And you even see Russian intervention in pro-Russian former Soviet states, like when there were protests against Tokayev in Kazakhstan in this January. Russian troops, along with other troops from the CSTO, were sent to Kazakhstan. So this has been part of Russia's coordinated foreign policy to keep countries from being able to become effective Western allies because they're too busy dealing with their own internal issues. Does anybody sort of want to comment on this foreign policy of Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to be really sort of objective about it, this is their version of the Monroe Doctrine, within their region. So if you look at the sort of spheres of influence, 19th century sort of, thinking to through the, let's say, first half of the 20th century or so, it was this idea that everything within the Americas was the purview sphere of influence, north-south, hemispheric of the United States. And this is a sort of, modern Russian rendition of the Monroe Doctrine. And to be really honest, most people probably wouldn't like this, but if he didn't choose Ukraine and picked almost any other state, I don't think most people would have cared. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's morally.
Well, I mean, I remember in 2008, I was doing question and answer site stuff. Yeah. And when Putin invaded Georgia in 2008, right, I had people literally asking questions.
How far from Atlanta?
How come I'm not seeing tanks? I live in Savannah. I live in Atlanta. Like, what's going on here? Geography 101 for Americans.
It's everyone in the world now because everyone uses social media. So that's the one advantage. We've exported it everywhere. The disease is global.
So this is the invasion map from the 5th of March. You can see that some things have changed, especially concretization in the southeastern area. But generally speaking, the forces are in roughly the same position because of the Ukrainians' ability to target using light arms the Russian military advances.
Yeah. And I would say one just fortunate thing by Ukrainian, I mean, it's fortunate and unfortunate simultaneously because the population is suffering, obviously, to a horrible degree, is that by the Ukraine having so many cities, including most of which people haven't heard of, but cities with 100,000 people or more, the Russians have nowhere near the forces to take any of these cities. And if you can remember back to the Iraq invasion and the subsequent, first 5 to 7 years after it, you took a place like Fallujah, and it took the United States 2 tries, and the second try basically, 20,000 to 30,000 troops to take a small, barely a city. So if you think of the scale, and the United States has combined arms, and so if you think of the scale of these cities, the Russians would have to literally forklift, 10% of its population there to stand a chance. And so, these cities offer these huge defensive positions and really constrain what the Russians can do ultimately. And of course, that's why they're going to bombard, starve, cordon, etc.
So we finally got into the Q&A section. Robert says we only have 20 minutes, so let's all boo him out of the room. Yes. So we can keep talking forever.
So Robert has 20 minutes.
Robert has 20 minutes. The rest of us, we have all day.
Yeah, I mean, F1 starting, so you can just watch F1 in the background, and away you go.
So anyway, one of the questions that kept coming up is why did the invasion take place now, not while Trump was in office? And I think that the key answer, and if our panelists want to dwell on this, I mean, I don't think we should, but if our panelists want to dwell on this, the thing is that during Trump's era, NATO was a very weak institution. There was a lot of pressure against it from the Trump administration, feeling that the Western European countries weren't pulling their due, and fearing that an invasion of Ukraine might bolster NATO, which is exactly what it did. I think Putin held off for as long as Trump was in power and was waiting for Trump to win the re-election and then continue weakening NATO. I think that was really his thought process. Remember, he did invade the Donbas under Trump's administration. So it's not like he didn't do anything. He just didn't lead a full-fledged invasion.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think, it's just history's so contingent. So you get these weird situations, which maybe don't make everybody feel good. But, there's some reality to this that I think at the end of the day, Trump's pressure and the whole administration's pressure, Pompeo, et cetera. And I always try to elevate this beyond like the single leader has a magic button, like a South Park episode, because it's just not like that. They have, thousands of people that work under them and that have similar beliefs or even more extreme beliefs. And my view is there was so much pressure being brought to bear against the European allies, and this big shift, which has really began under Obama, to shift to Asia, shift to China, et cetera, which sort of got amplified under Trump too. So I just think those dynamics represented a lack of need for the Russians to escalate. They were just looking to basically split the baby, right? The Europeans weren't supporting the Ukrainians. I mean, let's just be blunt here. They were actually working against them, right? They cut these gas line deals, which were devastating, really, to the Ukrainian economy.
Now, Greg, you mentioned that you might want to say something about this.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Did I?
Yeah. Okay. Never mind. That's fine. We can move on to another question.
I would rather. What I wanted to say. I would rather about like the second questions from without NATO boots on the ground. I think that the Ukrainian army cannot defeat Russian army, but they could create a stalemate, and the time doesn't work for Russia because it takes time for the sanctions to bite. So that's one of the things. But I also, my general opinion, that I think the Western media includes a lot of wishful thinking, and there is a lot of favorable analysis to where Ukrainian stands, and I think they underestimate the capacity of Russia to sustain and expand this campaign. Unfortunately, that's very much undermined in Western media. It's a big country; it has a lot more resources, and I'm a little bit surprised that people, but don't realize that, and nobody talks about it. However, I don't know, maybe Putin will be compelled at some point to stop. I hope so, but who knows? He cannot hold Ukraine. He cannot hold because of the insurgency, but he probably have enough forces to overrun it.
I'll make it very clear, since you can't go on Amazon.com and buy NATO boots. There are no such thing as NATO boots, right? So these are individual countries that contribute forces to the NATO alliance, and the NATO alliance assigns those as either combined or as individual forces. So we have to be, I know nobody really wants to maybe get into the weeds here, but that's actually very important, because you just can't call up NATO troops. It doesn't exist, right? You have contributions from states, and they have separate policies on the use of these troops. I don't see, outside of at the most extreme, some humanitarian medical forces that would be the most lightly, they'd have to be unarmed NATO medical forces that would go in, from the medical force command.
Right.
That would go in.
So let's. There was one question that I wanted to answer quickly. If Putin were to take over Ukraine, would Ukrainian become a secret language? I don't think that it's possible now. But in Belarus, for example, Belarusian is a language that is directly repressed by Lukashenko, and people are thrown in jail for speaking the Belarusian language in Belarus. So it's not entirely beyond the pale of possibility, but I don't think it's likely because of how many people speak Ukrainian as a dominant language now. Yeah. Now, one other question I wanted to ask before we get to the questions that have been asked by the audience is, Daniil and I have spoken separately about his work with NGOs like MSF in terms of ways to help the Ukrainian people who are suffering through this situation. And I was curious, Daniil, if you want to talk for a few minutes about where people can send their money, or what kinds of other donations they can give in terms of time or energy towards helping the people in Ukraine.
Sure. First and foremost, do not, and I mean that, do not engage with the International Red Cross Committee, because from what I'm hearing from my friends and family who are still in Ukraine, the International Red Cross Committee has done absolutely nothing in the month that the war has started to support Ukraine, apart from just like dragging dead bodies from one pile to another. And apparently leadership at the International Red Cross Committee has been very shady, as in they did not disclose their taxes for the last year. And apparently they funnel all of their monies into like buying cars and, properties and yada, yada, yada. I will send a link with you. So it's a link that has been shared with me. There are a lot of great nonprofits, and again, although I do represent Doctors Without Borders, I am not, for the sake of this presentation, I would not advocate for them, and I would encourage you to give to a nonprofit of your choice and the nonprofit that you trust, because not only I know my organization has missions in Ukraine, but also does the International Rescue Committee and the other resources. However, if you're really smart, I would encourage you to donate directly. I know there are a lot of, I assume there are a lot of, I assume there are a lot of Jewish population listening to this presentation. So I would encourage you to donate to your local communities with ties to Ukraine. I know there is this one that you can like, what's it called? Build a brick, or like donate for a brick, and and it would help. So think of ways, because if you do donate to a nonprofit, for instance, at our organization, we spend, in order to raise $1, we spend 13 cents, which is 13% of revenue. If you do want to help directly and multiply your efforts, I for sure know that the majority of people listening to this presentation have either friends or families. Just help them directly. Share the resources, and think also this way. A lot of Ukrainians are fleeing right now, and a lot of Ukrainians are lost and cashless. And then they didn't even know the immigration process. A lot of Ukrainians, although very intelligent, do not speak English. So maybe it would be a hurdle for them, and they would need information on how to immigrate, what to do, what documents bring with them. So maybe you can help with that. Just direct marketing, as I call it. Does it answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. So
one other thing, Richard, I think that might be good too, is that for most of you here listening in the either Western Europe or in the United States, Canada, et cetera, there are in your state or province, there are obviously large generational migrations of Ukrainians over the last 30, 50, 70 years. Most of them have their own pre-existing support organizations. So just doing a Google search or whatever search you use to where you live and Ukrainian, you'll start pulling up some resources of local churches, local organizations, et cetera. And then, they're all establishing, for obvious reasons, basically little command posts out there, little CPs to help, this process. And that's a way to sort of, maybe fuse to what Danielle was saying in that direct relationship.
Okay. There's another so I've gotten a lot of the questions. Given our time constraint, I don't know how many we'll get to, but there's a question here about the religious situation. So you've got Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow, and we've got the Autocephalous Ukrainian Church, which was recognized in 2019, and several different constituents of that church. To what extent?
Richard, we'll go a few minutes over. I'll give you a signal.
Okay. So to what extent is this a religious conflict? To what extent does religion play a role? And I'll start, and if the panelists want to join in afterwards, they can. My intuition here is that religion is a secondary part of this war. There's no religious reason that Putin is invading Ukraine, even though there are churches that belong to what is at least formally the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. That's not really the reason why it's going on. However, through the relationship between the church and the state, as exists in the East, these churches are becoming representatives of their nations and promoting the propaganda of both of their sides, right? The Ukrainian church is supporting Ukraine, the Russian church is supporting Russia. And this is actually very common in Eastern Europe, with Orthodox churches being national representatives in terms of their political and social legitimacy. So that's what we're seeing. And Patriarch Kirill's endorsement of Russia is not unique in Russian history. In fact, we see this throughout the Tsardom period. What's interesting about it is that the Ukrainians are seeing this and therefore saying, that's not my church. I'm not entirely sure what my church is. Maybe my church is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but the Russian Orthodox Church can't be my church because they're sending people to kill me, right? And that's the relationship that's really developing. If any of the panelists want to comment on that.
Yeah, I would just add that, Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, he is supporting Putin outright, completely. And the only question, I agree with you, it's primarily non-religious war, but there are theories that maybe Putin at this point, with the help of the Patriarch Kirill and the church, starts to believe in some messianic message that it's his destiny to go into history as a great Russian leader who would expand and promote Russian interests.
Yeah, and I would second this also, and I would really look at the demography at the survey level, right? So when you're looking at this 50 and over population or 60 and over population that acquired, let's say, the ability to worship at the end of, that they were already secretly doing it in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but that could do it openly starting in the 90s in Russia. That support base, which is, I kind of call it, it's like the TJ Maxx version of the Russian imperialism, right? It's sort of like the discount edition, right? Which is, some religion, some Russian iconography, some Russian, military power, all sort of mixed up together. That's a real powerful base that's still there, and that population isn't looking at day-to-day data. They're not looking at sort of international relations. They have a worldview that I think the only thing that will change that is when the policy changes. Even having casualties, which will just reinforce the worldview, right? So I think that's something people, I think, discount, to be honest. Yeah. I think they assume when the caskets come back, everybody's going to go jump up into the street. I think the under 30 crowd is the majority of that. And then obviously, let's say some familial relations of casualties that are 30s and 40s. I think a lot of people over 50 will still support the policy.
And can I just one small comment? If you think that Russians will openly, go protesting, you're going to be disappointed. It's not going to happen. People who protest are at great danger, and that is increasing incrementally. And it will be completely suppressed very soon. So it's not going to happen. I can guarantee it.
Yeah. Now, and the Russians. One last thing: the Russians have sort of mastered in the last 20 years this sort of expulsion policy, right? You could argue the gulags cost a lot of resources, so they figured out, well, just ship people out. Yeah, let them pick a country and just go. And that's really kind of now the policy, really. It's you got 24, 48 hours, get all your crap together. You're on a plane to Tashkent, like whatever. You're not going to be in Moscow anymore. And that is I argue that's going to scale, actually, as a policy.
Yeah. Now there have been a couple questions about whether the division of Ukraine somehow between perhaps Eastern and Western Ukraine, between sort of a Novorossiya and a Rzeczpospolita Ukraine, that if there were some kind of mechanism, would that be a viable solution? My intuition is to sort of laugh at that, but I'm curious of what our panel has to say about that.
It would be political suicide for any Ukrainian leader to accept that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I don't think it can happen.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think, look, there's a reality that is that we're seeing in front of our face, which is Russian war aims are changing because the facts on the ground are dictating it. And And the smaller war aims, which are arguably are the same aims that could have been achieved with 90% less losses in essence, is basically where the Russians seem to be going. Because if we're assuming most of the numbers right, which is somewhere between 30 to 40,000 Russians have either been, killed, or severely wounded, captured, or deserted, which I think those are probably pretty accurate. And they acquired basically most of what they could have acquired for probably 10% of that. I think that's the plan they're shifting to. And they're looking to, at some point, say, put a bow in it and call it "we won." And then the real test is going to be, how does Europe, the US, Ukraine, et cetera, respond to this? Does it shift into a full-blown insurgency, or can there be a deal? Because if there can't be a deal, then I think that's what Greg was pointing out earlier, where the Russians will just kinetically escalate dramatically. And that's where we'll shift from the scale of this as a humanitarian crisis to really a catastrophe. And I just think we don't know that answer. I mean, I think in the next month to two, we're going to find that out based on the facts on the ground.
Now, if I may just quickly add, Richard,
sure,
to this question. Look, war is hell. War creates suffering, and because of this conflict, we're seeing the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe since, I don't know, for how many years ago. The official numbers are 3.5 million displaced Ukrainians, but we do know that this number in reality is much, much larger. Also, don't forget that Ukrainian males are not permitted to leave Ukraine, right, which means that who is fleeing Ukraine? Who are those 3.5 million Ukrainians? They are women and children. And what do you have where you have unaccompanied females with children fleeing Ukraine with no cash? We talk trafficking, we talk rape, we talk extortion and slavery. Ideally, this war has to end yesterday, month ago. In my honest opinion, there is a way to it. If Russia wants to keep Luhansk and Donetsk, let them keep it. Let's divide Ukraine by a Dnieper River, or let's give Russians Donetsk and Luhansk, but let's fast track Ukraine to European Union. Let's revive, re-energize Ukrainian industries, because the rocket that put Yuri Gagarin in space was made in Ukraine by Ukrainian scientists. The first, the helicopters were made by Igor Sikorsky, a Kiev scientist from Kiev who moved to California. Ukrainians, so a lot of tech companies actually outsource their labor, and who does it? Ukrainians. Ukrainians are smart, and there is a lot of potential to it. So if there is a deal, let Russians keep Donetsk, Luhansk, and let Donetsk and Luhansk citizens decide for themselves if they want to stay in Donetsk and Luhansk under Russia, or if they want to move west. And let's end this conflict once and for all, because every day it's even more and more suffering. I was part of the Euromaidan in 2014, and during Euromaidan, 100 people died. I saw that with my own eyes. I was appalled by that. Now people are dying in thousands, and it's bad. It's barbaric.
And I would say, and to sort of build on that, and I think this is really important in the next month, is that we have some we're constructing some very all sides unhealthy negotiating dynamics, right? We're escalating. I'll put one in here. I'm sure this was a mistake, but you don't need these types of mistakes, right? So President Biden basically said that, Putin needs to be, cannot remain in power, right? So regime change is not exactly a great starting position for a negotiation. And so I just think there's a lot of if the goal is to create a negotiated settlement, which, by the way, it's unclear to me if that's actually the goal. I know a lot of people in the civic world are saying that, because, you know, we look at data and we look at history and everything gets to some settlement. But I think all the actors are not acting like they're attempting to construct a negotiated settlement right now. So we're still in this live kinetic phase where everyone's attempting to drive an outcome on the battlefield. And I think until the Russians, and I'd say the Ukrainians, and more importantly, everyone supporting the Ukrainians, the US, Poland, NATO, et cetera, and that's who is supporting them, shift to wanting to have a negotiated settlement of some kind, we're not going to be moving towards that. And let's not underestimate the effort it's going to take to start the process to do this, right? This is not going to be a drive-by by Macron and a couple dozen people over a weekend and a high five and then a piece of paper that's signed like that. This is going to be a very complex deconfliction process. It is likely to take months. And so if we don't, and my view is nobody is starting that. The UN clearly is irrelevant in this process. Maybe at a humanitarian level, they could become relevant. And I don't think anybody's bringing that up ever either.
Right.
So I just think there's a lot of these pieces that you want to be aware of going forward.
All right.
Hey, folks, we're going to have to wrap it up in 5 minutes. What I'd like to do before we sign off is have everyone kind of give their closing thoughts for the future or today's program. But before we do that, Richard, did you have anything else that you want to go over real quickly?
I mean, we have a lot of really great questions. Some of them.
That's why we're going to schedule part 3. So that'll be coming up potentially in April, but we don't have the date yet for that.
Yeah. No, so there's some points like, is Ukraine allied with Turkey? Because you hear about Turkish drones. They're not allies. They're more like friends who share a common enemy.
Friends with benefits.
Yeah,
Friends
exactly.
That's
the right way to put it. There's another question about the Azov battalion and the integration of those who do have a neo-Nazi character into modern Ukraine, similar to how Nazis are integrated into politics in the United States. I would say that that's really the right answer in terms of how it's going to happen. These people are voters. They're part of that constituency. They're not taking over the Ukrainian government anytime soon, but they are certainly a part of the varied militias that Ukraine has put together alongside its standing army. And
one other quick point, Richard, on that. I think it's very important that the Ukrainians at some point move from a localized militia construction of a military to a more professionally assigned non-territorial military. And then those types of forces get broken up. People go through traditional professional development, and you really start the sorting process like you would do in any modern military.
No, I would say that for those of you who are familiar with Israeli history, this is exactly what happened when the IDF was created in 1948. You had a number of different militias. Some of them, like the Irgun and the Stern Gang, were known internationally as terrorist organizations.
Terrorists, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
And you had some like the Haganah and the Palmach, which were much closer to an organized militia. But when the IDF came, they broke up the entire organization within the Stern Gang and within the Irgun and reallocated those soldiers so you could create a modern army. And that's exactly what Aaron is alluding to here. I think there's one last question that I want to address, which is that there's the Russian claim that there's genocides against Russian speakers within either the Donbas or in the area of southeastern Ukraine. There's no evidence behind those allegations. There's like it's not even if there's smoke, there's fire. There's smoke because somebody farted. Like this has nothing to do with anything. So if people are ready to give sort of their final closing, I think that I've spoken more than enough.
In 30 seconds or less, give us all your final thoughts on this situation.
Exactly. Like
and we'll come back. We'll all come back for round 3.
Let's start with Greg.
Yeah, no, I genuinely in agreement. I think it's the latest thing you spoke about is a manufactured thing. Certainly, there's no genocide, I really don't know how it's going to end. Unfortunately, that's all.
All right, Aaron.
Yeah. Thanks, so much for everyone for this. I believe in the next 60 days, we're going to start to see the economic repercussions, not just in Russia, but in Europe. And at some point, we're going to see if those things change the behavior by Russians and Ukrainians to start a negotiated settlement or not. And I think we want to be helping all parties to sort of push towards that, because we don't need more escalation at this point.
Daniel, you want to say anything?
Yes. So I've spoken to a military historian, and he draws parallel between this conflict and the conflict in Afghanistan, one land that has never been conquered, as in Ukrainian army volunteers and Ukrainian soldiers are using, basic tactics as, foxholes, digging in, and guerrilla warfare. And the saying that he had, if the Russian army has clocks, Ukrainians have the time. So long term, if this conflict goes on for another month, 2 months, a quarter, or year, Ukrainians will, because we will see the effect of sanctions in Russia, unless the China will step in and decides to help them. In my closing statement, think of Vladimir Putin as a bully. And the only way to deal with the bully is show your teeth. So after every attack, there should be a counterattack. And there is a prime opportunity, since the Russians are retreating to Donetsk and Luhansk and Mariupol, to enclose them. It's a prime opportunity for Ukrainians to kick their ass for good. So we need offensive weapons and not only the defensive ones. I know there has been a talk about supplying Ukrainians with F-16s, but it wouldn't really work because Ukrainians don't have the platform. If you're trained to fly,
hey Daniel, we have to wrap things up. So let's hold that discussion
more
for
words.
round
if
3.
If you're trained to fly in MiGs, you cannot fly F-16s. So planes are, could not be the solution.
Hey, awesome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. The YouTube recording of this, we'll send out the email link for that, and hopefully we'll continue part 3 on a TBD date in April. Stay tuned for that. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your weekend. Stay safe.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate you going deeper into more aspects of this. I really appreciate it. Okay. And I've been interested in everything you've had to say, so I really thank you. Blessings.
Thanks, Patty.